we're continuing with John Lennox, and we're talking about consciousness. And John, my scientific knowledge is absolutely dreadful. So this is just me thinking out loud. I often ask people in discussions and debates, where did consciousness come from? When did it begin? And they're never able to answer. And they say, one day we'll know. And they say, well, what do you think? And I said, well, what A.N. Wilson, the words that shook A.N. Wilson out of his atheism were, God breathed into the man and the man became a living being. Do you think that can be something to do with consciousness, the breath of God?
Oh, sure. I think when we look back at the history of life on Earth, there are several barriers that are proving, and I must word myself carefully, they're proving essentially increasingly impenetrable as time goes on. Mm-hmm. The first one is the origin of life itself. We know a little bit about the development of life, but its origin is still shrouded in deep mystery. And the more we understand of what life is, the less we have any idea of how it came to be. That is my view. Some people would dispute that. Mm-hmm. But then there is the next big barrier, is the question of human life and consciousness. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that Genesis is giving us a hint as to the source, mm-hmm. without giving us detail about the nature. What I mean by that is, I think one of the most significant statements in the whole of Scripture is, and God made human beings in his own image. Mm-hmm. And it has interested me greatly in the last while watching Jordan Peterson's lectures on the book of Genesis. Mm-hmm. They are utterly fascinating because he comes from a very strongly evolutionary perspective, but he recognizes this statement as the cornerstone of Western civilization. And in giving his lecture, he breaks off and he looks at the audience and he says, man, you ignore this at your peril. Mm-hmm. So the idea of God breathing into human beings, the breath of life and humans becoming living beings, those statements in Genesis 2, I believe, are the first steps in that chapter's unpacking exactly what it means to be human. And it ascends a ladder, starting from the dust of the earth, basic physical stuff, moving up to life itself, consciousness. You see, aesthetics is mentioned almost immediately. God made the trees good to look upon. Mm-hmm. And then there's life in its expansive sense, work, relationship with someone who's the same but other. And then the highest point of life is a relationship with God that's morally determined. Mm-hmm. And all those issues that are brought up by the very simply described but brilliantly deep discussion of what happens in the Garden of Eden. So I think, yes, the source is God. And as long as we're looking for a purely naturalistic, unguided process to produce consciousness, I think we're going to get nowhere.
Yeah. That's interesting, John, because my twin brother is the professor of brain science at Macquarie Uni and was a professor of brain science at UCL and the head of the hearing hub. He's the head of the hearing hub here in Australia. And we had a debate on a podcast, actually, and he is an atheist. So if you ever want to know what the opposite of me looks like as a non-Christian, he's a fairly urbane character.
I'd like to see that. I'd love to see that podcast because that interests me.
Yeah, I'll send you a link to it. But one of the things he said that I thought was very, I guess, imminent in the sense of Charles Taylor using the word the imminent frame. He said, well, when you go into a deep sleep or you put under a general anesthetic, you don't know anything. So that is all you are. And I think that doesn't leave room for the mystery that somehow God could enable you to be completely under an anesthetic, but a consciousness is still separate from that physicality aspect of you.
I'm not sure that I even understand what he's trying to say.
Well, he's saying once you go under a general anesthetic and you're unconscious, you don't know anything. So how could there be anything like a living spiritual aspect to you that's sort of
What does he
hovering?
mean? What does he mean you don't know anything? That's like, it seems to me like saying if you switch a computer off, there's nothing in its memory.
Well, that's what I was getting at. In our rather Northern Irish twin brother tete-a-tete, I think.
And yeah,
well, I shall watch it with interest.
Yeah, the other thing with that, John, you know, I mean, I take that thing kind of personally because, well, as you know, in 2011 I was ill and in and out of a coma for 7 weeks. And, you know, just talking to the psychologist afterwards and the consciousness, there are lots of things I wasn't conscious of in that I could remember and things like that. But there are a lot of things that are still buried in my mind that occasionally come out and I remember. But I remember not having experienced them, I think, the first time. So the human mind for me is utterly amazing. And the link between mind, consciousness, body, and spirit is just something I find quite astonishing. And you are, professor of the philosophy of science, and yet you still have that sense of wonder as well, don't you?
Mm.
Oh, I do, absolutely. And if people want to know a little bit more of what I think about it, I was once asked to contribute to a volume on this topic, and they asked me to write on how I account for the existence of consciousness, thought, and the human self. Mm-hmm. And this appears in a volume edited by a man called Varghese, Varghese. And the book is completely misleadingly entitled The Missing Link, because it's not talking about evolution, it's talking about consciousness. And there are several Nobel Prize winners contribute to this. And it was a fascinating thing because my response to the invitation was, do you think I'm going to solve the mind-body question in a short essay? And he said, no, you misunderstand. You must be asked these questions constantly. What is your take on this? Mm-hmm. And it's a relatively short essay, but I think it's very important to distinguish between the mind story and the brain story. Mm-hmm. I can tell you what's in my mind. Mm-hmm. And if you have access to the right technology, you can tell me something of what's in my brain. Mm-hmm. In other words, you can watch which portions of my brain light up when I see David Robertson, for example, or I see a Scottish loch, or I see, even better, a picture of the Giant's Causeway. You can make those correlations. But the big mistake is to think that those correlations are all there is, and that therefore the mind is the brain. I feel that's an extremely superficial response. And as you say, there's a huge mystery. But as I look at things, there's a mystery about nearly everything.
Yeah.
Because think about it, energy. We think we know what it is because we can use it. Nobody knows what energy is. And there are so many things, we just don't know what they are, but we make do. We have a word energy. We have a word gravity. We have a word consciousness. And it's an important thing to have those tools to be able to describe things that people recognize. But the mistake is to think we know what they are. Isaac Newton was clever enough when he had his theory of gravitation. When he thought about what it was, he said, non fingo hypothesi. I don't make hypotheses. I don't know what it is. And we need a lot of humility and honesty and sheer wonder at the natural world, because these things, we don't even know what they are. So thinking we're going to construct them in the next 30 years, I think is an absolute pipe dream. However, the technologies that are trying to move in that direction, the narrow AI technologies, are raising vast ethical questions for the world as a whole at a very practical level. The bias, for example, in facial recognition programs, the bias in programs that are now AI systems doing job interviews where you have no face-to-face contact. And so you're at the mercy of a machine, and therefore at the mercy of the bias of the programmers, which inevitably is built in. And people at the highest level of industry in these fields are already getting together to try to develop ethical principles, the Asilomar principles, for example, and others. Mm-hmm. And thousands of the leading players, like the late Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, and all of these are signing these things. But it's one thing to have an agreed statement of ethics, it's another thing to implement it.
It reminds me of the Tower of Babel. I'm going to ask Steve, because we are going to come towards the end of our time, and Steve wants to ask about the end of the world, conspiracy theories. No, I think Steve did have a particular question for you.
Nothing about charts and maps from Revelation. It's just a question. Ross Douthat in the New York Times said that 2020 and the pandemic kind of pushed things forward 10 years. So what we're expecting culturally, socially, in a progressive narrative, I suppose, in how education systems are struggling or how religion's struggling, has been pushed forward 10 years. So he sort of telescoped 2020 into 2030. Now, it does look a little pessimistic, and our conversation shows me that you're not much of a pessimist, so I can't pull that lever. What do you think 2030? Do you think he's right to think that things will have sort of ramped up and they've gotten a lot worse? And what do you think is beyond what he's saying? Is he right or is he wrong that things have been pushed along too quickly?
I think the question is too simplistic, for the simple reason that we do not yet know, according to the medics anyway, what implications COVID-19 has. The nature of it is very scary. And only yesterday they discovered that there are very odd things happening to blood clotting in the brains of people with COVID-19, having massive strokes, and their blood thickening, sometimes 100 times beyond normal. And they were saying, we've never seen this before. And I think it's a very, foolhardy, I would say, person who's going to predict, but clearly the world has changed. We have, in having to isolate ourselves, this is a new experience. Our telecommunications have been used far more than before, our contact with each other. But how this is going to pan out, here we are in the UK, and the medics tell us we're on the edge, possibly, of a second spike. The United States is in a dire strait, as are Russia and many other countries. And I wouldn't even begin to predict, except that it's clear the pace of change is very high indeed. What about the economic situation in our world? I just do not know. But in my book, I have risked saying something about what Scripture says about the future, precisely because I believe it has given us a credible account of the past. It has given us a really credible, evidence-based answer to Harare's questions. And Harare thinks that there is going to be a homo deus, that is, we are going to produce the man who is God. And he says with a small g, he says, think Greek gods. But you see, putting it crudely, he's too late. And the irony of the whole AGI position is that superintelligent human already exists. If the claim that Jesus Christ made when he was on earth is true, that he is God incarnate, then you have a superintelligent human who already exists. In other words, he is homo deus in the fullest sense. But the fascinating thing for me, Stephen, is simply this, that all this AI stuff represents a longing to be immortal, a longing for the future godlike character of human beings. And they desperately hope it'll be benevolent rather than tyrannical. And they're reaching out to be gods. This is a bit like the Tower of Babel, reaching for heaven But the Christian message turns that on its head. And its central claim is that God is reaching down to us, and indeed reaching in an amazing sense, that God became human. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, says John. And this is the central claim of Christianity, the grand miracle, as C.S. Lewis called it, the miracle of the incarnation. And that's why I believe that as Christians, we have a message that needs to be injected carefully, thoughtfully, and I hope credibly into the current debate.
Yeah, John, that's actually a great note for us to finish on, because the hope of Christ. I mean, you're right. Actually, the Bible's an amazing book, because the Tower of Babel, Genesis 1 and 2, human beings being made in God's image, the attempt of humanity to try and make itself God, all those different kinds of things. And then the notion, the idea, the truth that God became man. Man doesn't become God, but God becomes man. And that, to me, Harare's book is, so many people have bought it and read it, and I think it's so depressing. And then I've got the gospel, and it's the complete opposite of depressing. It's saying in a broken world comes a complete human being. And I think that's a great way for us to end. Can I thank you so much for being willing to speak to us here in Australia?
But let me say, it's always a delight to be in Australia, either literally or virtually. I have such happy memories of my visit around your country.
I'll let Steve say goodbye to you as well. But again, God bless you, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, John. I think you just tapped into the longing aspect of it. Was so good. It felt like we'd had a meal, but there's something more. There's dessert to come. That's what it felt like. So thank you so much.
That's my pleasure. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.